Hello, I'm Scott Thompson, and welcome to After 10. The Korean government recently proposed its second basic plan of national energy, and it calls for a reduction in the use of nuclear power from 40 to 20%. On today's After 10, we take a look at the plan and discuss the future of nuclear energy in Korea. The government's second basic plan of national energy made a lot of headlines this week. The second basic plan has presented its 5 major tasks, which include managing demand, building a dispersed electric power generator, protecting the environment, strengthening energy security, and promoting policies with the people. We take a deeper look at the government's basic plan of national energy that will play a key role in the nation's energy policy for the next 2 decades. Professor Suh, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, as the name suggests, this is the second basic plan of national energy,
Right.
Which implies, of course, there was a first
5 years
basic
ago.
plan. Sure, 5
Right.
years ago. Tell us how this basic plan differs from the one from 2008.
There's one very peculiar difference between the first one and this one, and that has to do with nuclear power. It used to be like on the 40% range as far as energy mix is concerned, and if it comes to nuclear, but now it's down to about 20% range. It might be 20 or even 29, but certainly not 30. So it's a huge reduction from that perspective.
And of course, there's a reason behind that plan for a reduction. Tell us a little bit about what the reasoning is behind that plan.
I would say there are 2 things. Or actually, to be more precise, it's like nuclear quadrilemma. There are 4 dilemmas, in fact. One has to do with Fukushima, second, public acceptance, and then safety, and also fake certificates, etc., etc. And then, last but not least, shale gas. There are those 4 pretty much adverse effects on the nuclear power, and the government had to do something about this, and this is what it is by now.
Of course, a reduction from 40% to 20%, that's a big cut. What sorts of changes are going to take place, are we going to see as this process moves along, as the country does move to reduce its reliance on nuclear energy?
Exactly. Probably that's the right direction, but not this much, because, if it comes to energy, it has to be a policy based upon not 5 years, but it has to be 50 years. And it has to be consistent. And then from that point of view, there's no continuity, no consistency. What I'm saying is it's a little bit too abrupt change from 40 down to 20%. So we're suddenly talking about 30-some nuclear power plants instead of 50. And the question remains, what next? What is going to replace that gap? And as far as I can see, there's no clear picture about it. So that's the question mark.
And the question also is this a realistic goal then, this drastic cut?
It really depends. If you really want to make this realistic, then you have to have an alternative. There are 2 things. One has to do with probably demand control. Everybody may be forced to spend less energy, less electricity, and if possible at all, change electricity back to gas, coal, the primary energy source. And second of all, they can try to really tighten their belts so that they can be spending less and less electricity. That's pretty much gruesome, and actually it's painstaking. In many cases they're not, so there's a certain limit. And other than that, then we have to be expanding the use of conventional power, fossil fuel, coal, natural gas, even shale gas. And then we're going to run into that same old problem of CO2 gas emissions. So there's no clear way around this problem. It's a pretty much hard task to solve, and then apparently there are a lot of terms to be solved in terms of looking at this equation.
You talk about the supply and the demand.
Right.
Electric power policy in the past has really focused on the supply. This one seems to put a bit more focus on demand as well. Can you tell us what the goal is, how this sort of shifts that focus to that direction?
Right, Scott, because that's the right kind of trend. We've been stuck with supply chain and all that, and then suddenly it's the right move to come to demand control or management for that matter. But as I said again, it has to be continuous and actually consistent. It's a little bit too abrupt. And when it comes to consumption and then demand control and management, you must have one thing in advance, which has to do with electricity supply surplus. Actually, Korea is talking about 5% surplus. It's so little. So whenever something happens like this case, nuclear power plants coming down and shutting down, 3 of them in a row, then we run into this kind of a threat of a national blackout. So we have to have at least some reserve before that. If you think about the States, 25%, Europe, 30%, Germany, 80%, even Japan, 35%. We're talking about 5% at the most. So there's a huge gap. So until we fill in that gap first, we cannot really be talking about demand management, because it's just too limited. We cannot do any further than this.
So in looking at the landscape and the reality of the matter right now, it seems inevitable. Most people say that electricity rates are going to have to go up. What would you say to those concerns for those people who have very valid concerns about that?
It's more than valid, in fact. It's just a hard truth of the matter, because if you're going to that direction of downsizing the nuclear power portion from 40 to 20%, then we're essentially talking about 3 times the current rate in 15, 20 years. That's very awful. And actually, I don't think anybody's ready to do that.
And electric power, of course, has also been a big supporter for the Korean economy, continues to be. This idea of changing the playing field a bit, people are concerned that it is going to affect the economy as a whole.
Right.
What would you say to those concerns?
Actually, so far, the basic, horsepower producing portion was coming from electricity. The cheap electricity, probably the cheapest on the whole planet. Probably second to Canada, but certainly one of those cheapest rates in the whole world. And that means anybody can come in and then make use of those cheap electricity producing facilities, and then go from there. That means economic growth and development for not just our companies, but somebody else from outside the country. But suddenly now the electricity bill is going to go up maybe twice as much, 3 times as much within probably 5 to 10 years. Then I don't think we can maintain this kind of pace. So it would mean reduction or actually decreased, economic developmental thrust. That'll mean again increase in the electricity bill and everything else with that. So that means we might run into a kind of depression in the long run. So it's a pretty much risky business of thinking about raising the electricity bill. We have to think about it.
Let's get back to the reasoning for a moment here, because in our discussion here, all the things that are placed on the table are, we're looking at negative consequences of this change. It's going to take a long time. The taxpayer is going to have to pick up a larger burden. We're talking about possible effects on the economy as well. This push to reduce nuclear power, tell us a little bit about the reasoning, why this push is being made, and why it is so important now for the government to put this out there.
I think there are 2 things. The culprit was essentially Fukushima, but after that there was all this series of fiascos and forfeited papers and bogus papers, test results. But so we got lost. As I see it, it's not necessarily the nuclear power that the public doesn't like, but it's more like the way the people or the utilities, regulators, managing these plants. So it's different. It's not necessarily nuclear power itself, but how they manage these facilities. Might have been doing good. So we have to be pretty much careful about this. But currently, there is a consensus that we're not in a position to expand any nuclear power at the moment. So the government had to take this kind of sort of abrupt change from the first plan over to the second plan. So I'm agreed that they made the right decision, but if it comes to the percentage, it's a little too much. It could have been 30% rather than 20%. That's what I'm saying. So, and other than that, there has to be another alternatives. Renewables, but wind power and solar are a little too slow to come. And second of all, we're short of those two sources. Germany has a lot of wind, a lot of solar power, even UAE, but they're coming to nuclear. So Korea is short of these two renewable sources. So the only alternative would be again coal, natural gas, or even shale gas. But again, they are running into that Kyoto Protocol problems. So we're stuck in here. So I'm agreed that government is taking the right decision at the first place. But things, what next? I don't see any alternative there. There's no alternative. And there has to be plan B. I don't see any plan B there. That's the problem. Plan A, fine, as is. But then there's to be plan B. And I didn't see any plan B in the second proposal, or actually, that's something that's been put together by the citizens group, or actually working group members, not necessarily the reflecting the policy of the government yet, but it will be reflected as much as it can be.
You don't see anything right now that really encourages you here in Korea. I mean, what alternatives do you see as being viable alternatives in the future?
Nuclear.
Nuclear.
Like it or not. It's not evil, it's not good, but it's something we must need. So again, it boils down to the problem of public acceptance, public awareness. Public awareness is more important than ever and more crucial than anywhere else. This is the spot, hot spot. So as far as we cannot see any other alternatives because of either CO2 or immature technology or absolute lack of resources, then there's just one remaining there. I don't think everybody's going to like this, but nuclear. So thing is that even though we don't like nuclear power, the right direction might be to make it as safe as possible, as practical as can be, rather than staying away from it. If you really want to stay away from it, the only alternative is to save, save, save. But it's painstaking, and we cannot be saving all the time. We cannot come back to 20th century by now. We cannot be stopping the metros and all those electricity bills. Actually, all this hot water is something very much uncomfortable, and I don't think anybody's going to afford it. And again, the electricity bill that is going to go up. So all these things put together, we have to be looking at a little bit a different direction.
When you look at alternate sources of energy worldwide, looking outside of Korea, what encourages you? What gets you excited? Where do you think the future is around the rest of the world?
Renewables. The United States is blessed enough, both wind power in California, Arizona, okay, and also solar power, California, beautiful part of the country, and even shale gas. But thing is, we don't have them. None of it. Okay, so that's where that's really what differentiates the Republic of Korea from the USA, from some other countries. And think about United Arab Emirates and Turkey and Saudi Arabia. They're coming to nuclear. Why not solar power? Because it's expensive. They got less sun, but they come to nuclear. So we're in a much more desperate situation. So again, we have no other choice. Nuclear is not the best, but certainly the second best we have to live with.
If I can underscore this point again, though, we're talking about a reduction, right, in the use of nuclear energy, right. And yet you're saying it's the best basically choice we have right now. But if you're talking about a reduction, right, we're going to have a shortfall somewhere. There's a gap to be filled, right? So where does that gap, or basically what fills that gap in the long run? Because there is going to be a shortfall there, right?
I know. So again, the thing is that we have to be really relying on the basic small facilities around, and we have to be relying on the sort of distributed or dispersed grid system so that we can be generating from many places. We have our own generators, for example. This building has one, okay? Those are the means. And a little bit of solar power, wind power, fine. A little bit of filling in gaps here and there. And then we should be trying pretty much hard to save. Okay, then we can come up with some solution, but that's possible only when we're up to a certain level of electricity surplus, or actually redundant surplus. And again, they're talking about 20%, 30, even 80%. We're talking about 5%. So we have to be coming up to that level, and then we can be talking of saving. Otherwise, however hard you try, there's always the limit. And it's going to be like only the public, actually you and me, are going to pay more and spend less. I don't think we can do it forever, maybe just for the time being. So until then, the government has to do something more than just, pressing the people to just save. Okay, so again, we have to fill in this gap of demand, supply chain, and we are at a certain level, maybe 10, 20% hopefully surplus, because 15% is minimal. And then we need additional 5% for emergency. We have only that just 5% emergency. We don't have any normal or nominal 15%. That's the problem. So we have to be filling in that nominal percent, and then think about saving and thinking about other maybe energy sources. But I think we're doing a little bit too fast. Okay, so that's where the problem is starting from, and we have to fix it sooner rather than later.
Anybody who's been paying attention to the news recently knows that there have been problems with the nuclear power plants in the country. During the lifespan of this plan, the lifespan of some of those nuclear power plants may come to an end. What happens to them once their, expiration date, as you might call it, comes up?
Oh, Scott, you just opened the Pandora's box.
Is that right?
Okay, it's a tough story, actually, and sometimes hard to swallow, but we have to face it, because we have to be thinking about exit strategy, or actually retirement. And the term life expansion is a little misleading, because nuclear power plants are not organic, okay? They don't have any life to start with. We're just talking about license. There's a certain period of license. It could be 30 years, 40 years, and it could be as long as 60, even 80 years in Canada, in the States. So it's a license matter. And when does it end? Whenever the government or the public doesn't want it to operate any longer. So we rather call this continued operation, or license renewal, okay? So if it comes to the end of that license, then we have to be seriously thinking about closing it, dismantling it, and decommissioning it. And most likely, Korea Unit 1 is going to face it first, because it's the oldest one, but it's still pretty young, 35 years old by now, still young. And it could go as long as probably 60, even 80 years, if it were on the soil of the USA, but we're not sure. It might be that it might be closing maybe next year. So we have to be thinking about them, and that means during the given 30 years, after like 30 years, starting from today to 2035, there'll be about 10 nuclear power plants being decommissioned. So what do? I don't know. Renewables? I don't think so. Coal? Shale gas? We're not blessed with shale gas at all. So nuclear? Fusion? No, I don't think so. Maybe 100 years. So nuclear power is the only one. So that's where it boils down to. So we have to be really thinking about this long-term project, not just 5 years. It's supposed to be more like 50 years or even 100 years, not 5 years. So this is a little bit too short-sighted in this sense.
And then it becomes a question of, do you extend those plants or do you build new ones? I mean, that's essentially the question, right?
Exactly. So there are two ways. One has to do with the extending this license period over to 80 years, which the United States going forward, or just dismantle them and then build new ones. So it's just a matter of choice, which is more economical to a certain country's needs and situation. So it's just a matter of policymaking in the long run.
All of these changes that we're talking about are coming to a degree, as you mentioned, because public opinion has turned a bit against nuclear energy.
Yeah.
When you look at the two sides here and you look at the reality of the situation, the facts of the matter, you've got one side, activists who are campaigning against nuclear power for various reasons. On the other side, you have the people who say that nuclear energy is really the only viable alternative right now. It's necessary for the future of power supply. Looking at the two sides, how do you sort of balance the two? How do you find a middle ground to bring the two sides together to an agreement?
For the time being, I don't see any agreement. It's like, eternal parallelized, going just in parallel. They don't meet each other, but they're supposed to meet because both sides have their own points, pros and cons. So we have to be able to lay them out on the table, all the agenda that are relevant to this. Nuclear power, is that the only source? I don't think so. I didn't say it. I just said this looks to be the only viable source for the time being because there are no alternatives around. It's a different story in the US, might be different in the UK, different in France, Russia, Japan, you just name it. It depends upon the country's situation, culture, and status. But as it comes to Korea, then looks to be just a must. I hate nuclear power myself. I've been working on this for more than 30, 40 years. I'm old enough. I don't like it because of this radioactivity, unseen danger of this radiation, just pretty much awful in fact. But this is something that we have to go with. Without it, the other thing is to be paying much more for the same electricity. And I don't think I am going to do that, not for the time being. I might change in the future when I go old enough. And maybe I'm still too young. But until then, I don't think we can do any better than this. That's currently what we're and what the thing is all around in the Republic.
Certainly the landscape is complicated. The future,
very much.
We don't know, of course, yet, but we do appreciate you being on the show and providing your insights and shedding a little light on this very complicated matter very much.
Okay.
Thank you so much. We
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll see you next week after 10.